We're going to continue talking about the latest trends in identity and access management. Over the last few sessions, we've talked about the way in which the industry is moving. We've had some interesting conversations with some of our guests. Today is going to be about a couple of acronyms and maybe a test for some of you, but I'm sure most of you in the audience have probably heard these terms: CIEM and CIAM. I'm sure many of you have heard these terms used sometimes a bit loosely and sometimes very specifically when they're referring to some very specific use cases. So, what is CIEM? CIEM is Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. So, what is cloud infrastructure entitlement management? With the rapid expansion, particularly in the public cloud, what we've seen between AWS, Azure, and GCP, for example, there's been a massive proliferation in the enterprise space, and identities in the public cloud are very different from identities, for example, in on-prem. As an example, for the sake of this discussion, when we're talking about entitlements, we're really referring to the IaaS or infrastructure as a service scenario, and to some extent, even the platform as a service scenario or PaaS. Now, IaaS and PaaS create a lot of challenges when it comes to identity and access management because fundamentally, we have to treat all of these identities as super users or identities with elevated privileges or enhanced privileges essentially. So, what happens is with the rapid proliferation of the public cloud, namely AWS, Azure, and GCP, to name the top three in the enterprises, what we've seen is the challenge with managing identities has become exponentially more difficult, or maybe more complex, and to some extent more convoluted. The reason being that what we need to treat identities in the public cloud, especially in the case of IaaS and PaaS or infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, we need to essentially treat these identities as privileged identities or identities with elevated access. Some people may call it identities with super user access. The reason being is that these kind of identities can spin up VPCs, for example, in AWS. They can spin up resources, they can open up security, and these kind of accesses can give you a ton of different variations which will affect the security and the threat landscape. So what I think the key defining feature for cloud infrastructure entitlement management would be variability, fluidity, and continuous change essentially. So what happens essentially is that because it is so easy, relatively speaking, compared to the on-prem deployments, to spin up new resources, and these resources could be compute resources, these could be storage. In the case of DevOps, these could be API calls and API resources, and for example, S3 buckets in the case of AWS. So what happens is we see a situation when it comes to cloud DevOps in particular, for example, where the blast radius can significantly increase based on the way certain applications are built and certain accesses are given to elevated identities. So essentially, what we're saying here is in the cloud infrastructure entitlement management space, we need to treat at a broad level all of these identities from a privileged identity management or privileged access management concept. So to use the acronyms PIM and PAM, we kind of have to look at CIEM in through that lens. But that's not all, because of the diversity of functions that are available through these elevated privileges in the IaaS and PaaS scenarios. A CIEM presents some unique challenges. So I don't believe there's one single tool, and the way the industry is evolving right now is to get a very good understanding of what your infrastructure footprint is, what your application footprint is, what your DevOps footprint is, and then having a CIEM strategy that effectively brings these all of these under one umbrella. There are tools that attack some of these aspects, but currently what we've seen is there's a combination of tools. There's some overlap that kind of gives you those protections that are needed in the case of a good CIEM strategy. Now, when it comes to the CIEM strategy as compared to the traditional RBAC or IAM strategy, what we find is that because of the reasons mentioned earlier, the typical RBAC or role based access control, which is relatively static in nature in on prem or historically has been, if we cannot treat the cloud entitlements in the very same from the same lens. What happens is that when you have so much movement, so much spinning up of VPCs, spinning of resources, scaling up, scaling down, the traditional RBAC concepts don't necessarily apply directly. So what you have essentially to look at is for a good CIEM strategy is visibility primarily. Do you have visibility into what an identity can do? Can an identity go and open up S3 buckets? Can you mistakenly make an S3 bucket public? Can you, by mistakenly, open up some firewall ports or some security? Uh, when you look at the web of aspects or accesses or entitlements that a particular identity gets in the CIEM space, that's where visibility of that identity becomes extremely critical, especially because with certain identities, a lot of things can change. The security landscape, the footprint of the infrastructure or application deployment can change vastly in the span of a few days or hours in case you're scaling up for certain use cases, for example. So I covered visibility. Now, the next thing that comes to play in CIEM strategy is right sizing permissions, if that's one way of putting it. So this would mean a continuous look at the permissions or entitlements that are given to a particular identity, a much more frequent, for lack of better words, recertification or review of permissions given to an identity, and just even going to the extent of just-in-time permissions, which is not very different from PIM and PAM concepts that apply to traditional on-prem just-in-time entitlements that are quite popular in recent years to kind of really secure the threat landscape. In addition to that, for a good CIEM strategy, analytics play a key role. Now, analytics is very closely tied in with visibility. Some of the tools available today, both natively from many of the cloud vendors as well as other tools, give a lot of analytics into what's changing, what's being accessed, who's accessing it. So, having a good analytic platform or framework around you in your CIEM strategy becomes extremely critical. In addition to that, compliance in CIEM becomes very critical. Automating certain compliance functions becomes very critical just because of the fluidity and the variability of the environment. The environment is extremely dynamic, especially when you go into DevOps shops, you're scaling up, scaling down, or companies where there's a lot of in house development. There is a lot of movement, for lack of better words, in the infrastructure footprint when you compare it to the traditional data center or the on-prem models. Now, some of this fluidity also existed in the on-prem models with virtualization, but when you go into the cloud, that gets exponentially more complex and to some degree more convoluted. So to summarize, for a good CIEM strategy, you're looking at visibility, you're looking at giving permissions, just the permissions needed or just in time permissions. You're looking at analytics, and you're looking to some extent automating compliance as much as possible. So all of these to some degree are intertwined. But to conclude, for cloud identity and entitlement management, that really is where a lot of the focus is for many of the enterprise organizations that are deep in the cloud. Now, many organizations have been tackling this. You may or may not call it CIEM, but as a practice, CIEM is gaining more and more traction in terms of having a CIEM strategy. And moving forward, what we've seen working with customers is this strategy is becoming extremely critical from a visibility standpoint as the footprint in the cloud, public cloud, becomes more and more. Now, the same concepts, kind of apply across, many of the concepts of the CIEM do apply regardless of whether it's public, hybrid, or on-prem. However, with the CIEM, because of the very fast pace, the diversity, and the very intricate nature in which the cloud resources can be set up very rapidly, is what makes a CIEM strategy very critical and frankly different from a regular IAM strategy or a PIM PAM strategy. So, in terms of vendors that are attacking this space right now, there is no one specific magic bullet, just like many other things in IAM. One would say that you have to look at your specific use cases, and a good combination of strong analytics, strong PIM and PAM foundations, and a combination of technologies would go into a good architecture for CIEM. So with that, we're going to take a bit of a pivot into CIAM, which is a different concept, customer identity and access management, and we will double click further into CIEM and some of the more deeper concepts around CIEM in terms of granting access to resources, granting access to storage, granting access to services, those kind of things. So with that, I'm going to talk and a little more on CIAM. I know it's not a lot of acronyms today. CIAM is Customer Identity and Access Management. Now, Customer Identity and Access Management has been around for a long time. Maybe the term was not coined earlier, but we see the term being used more and more. And traditionally, CIAM has focused a lot on B2C use cases, most notably, for example, single sign-on. So, in its most basic form, customer identity and access management in the B2 space, B2B, sorry, in the B2C space has been around for the better part of 2 decades or more. However, what we are finding is that a lot of you who work in this field will see that outside of the B2C as well as in the B2C cases, when you go deeper into more than just authentication and you get into authorizations, and when you get into B2B cases where you want to look at complex situations of onboarding and offboarding B2B clients and the specific entitlement that B2B clients and identities within each B2B partner organization and how to manage those, that becomes more complex. So traditionally, what we've seen in the IAM space so far, there really has not been like a CIAM focus in terms of a technology so far. More or less, what we've seen is that it's a bunch of use cases, sometimes customized, sometimes retrofitted, or an existing IAM platform is taken. There's some customizations built on top of it. We've seen a lot of customers that have built, web front ends for B2B access and customize it, and at the back end, these may connect into IAM platforms. However, more and more we see that the IAG space and IAM provisioning space is moving towards catering to the CIAM market. And for many of you who work in organizations, which is fairly typical to have B2B partnerships, managing the external relationships in an elegant manner becomes extremely critical. In past sessions, we've talked about kind of the external identity management as well, and I will go through a little more detail shortly. But the point on CIAM is that as a thought process and as a strategy, uh, part of a larger IAM strategy, CIAM is becoming more and more critical. We see more and more CIOs and CISOs now looking at what is the external strategy here in addition to the internal identity strategy. Now, in the earlier part of this session, we talked about the cloud entitlement strategy. On the same token, the external identity strategy is becoming extremely critical. So, what we've seen for more mature companies that are more far along in their IAG or IAM roadmap, we see a very robust foundational internal IAM strategy, a good foundation to the cloud entitlement strategy, and then also a very good foundation and elegant handling of the external customer identity strategy. Now, what we're seeing right now in the CIM space, it's kind of like I mentioned earlier, customizations, bolt-ons. Sometimes, certain use cases fit pretty well in the existing traditional platforms, and then a lot of customizations and a whole lot of integrations. Now, integrations are here to stay just because the nature of external access. There are going to be integrations, and sometimes these could be at the DevOps level. Very often, these are also at just the end user level when end users get access to internal systems, and I'm referring to B2B users specifically, where it gets a little more complex because these users traditionally have a little more access than the traditional B2C cases. So, with that, I want to take a segue into EIAG, which is ISSQUARED's product, External Identity and Access Governance. I just covered the fact that in the CIAM marketplace, we today find most of the traditional IAM vendors don't really have a solution that is built ground up that is focused on external identities. What we saw really was a gap in the market on how to handle external identities. And that really was the genesis of EIAG, which is External Identity and Access Governance. Now, as you can see on the slide, this is it's an eye chart, but it's a fairly typical example of how A medium to large organization operates in terms of the interdependencies and collaboration with external agencies. These could be marketing agencies, these could be distributorship, these could be sales companies, sales agents, these could be law firms, and the list of HR partnerships, that's extremely common. Benefits partnerships, very common. You can also have outsourced business process outsourcing partnerships. So it is not uncommon for a medium to large size organization to have not just tens but hundreds of B2B partnerships. We've dealt with organizations that have hundreds of partnerships. It could be for manufacturing or research and development in pharmaceuticals. It could be for distribution and distributorships in terms for consumer goods, and the list is endless. You have a lot of interaction that goes on with marketing agencies, ad agencies, and then in the case of law firms, for almost all companies in the mid to large space, there's a tremendous amount of interaction that happens with legal firms. So, what we've seen with external access or external identity governance with companies is that there's some challenges. Most notably, external identity and access governance is sometimes a tough nut to crack in terms of the exact granular access that is needed by the outside parties. And usually, companies are a lot more sensitive to access given to B2B partners because these are really external agencies. So, a lot more thought has to go into role management as well as aspects around how those identities, the life cycles of those identities are treated. So by its nature, sometimes figuring out the right access and extremely limited or verticalized access for external parties or B2B parties becomes very critical. Two, onboarding for external parties typically tends to be very tedious and very and takes long. For example, it goes all the way from identity vetting or vetting out the identities that need to be onboarded. There's the concept of having a custodian, which works pretty well at the third party users. There's legal aspects around having MSAs and legal protections and agreements on best practices, and that the B2B party has to agree to. And then, most notably, visibility becomes a pretty massive challenge when it comes to external identities. It's pretty common to see companies struggling with uh, getting a full picture of which external identities have access to which systems and whether they still work for the external company. So recertification, for example, takes on a whole new goes to a whole new level when it comes to external identity. So this is not just internal. You now have to check with an external company. You really don't know, you don't have much control over who these people are. So that understanding of having an identity custodian, this is a critical concept when it comes to external identity governance. Somebody that's trusted from the third party who has the authority and responsibility to onboard and offboard employees from that company, and notify the enterprise in a timely manner. These things become critical. So what we did with EIAG, or external identity and access governance, is make this whole aspect of handling external identities very elegant in terms of the entire identity life cycle for the external identity. So right from onboarding, the workflows for setting up the custodian being somebody from an external party that has the authority and the knowledge to onboard the right persons from their organization to the right role, to the termination of those folks or offboarding of those folks. Now, to take a step back, what we've also done with EAIG is we've made it very simple and elegant to set up organization structures where you can set up an external party as an organization unit that then can be maintained at a high level, and you can get visibility into that, and then you can get different roles within that organization. So it's, like I said earlier, it's fairly common to see, or not uncommon at all, to see companies with dozens, if not hundreds, of external partnerships. So when you look at this problem at scale, having an elegant process to manage external identities and external organizations is very critical. Knowing who's being offboarded, getting offboarded in a timely manner, having somebody that leaves an organization, making sure they don't still have access into your organization. These are concepts that are very critical. There's several aspects that come together for a good external strategy. So we'd encourage you to take a look a little deeper into EIG. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, or if you want a demo. what we've seen that where we've had a lot of success in the deployment of EIG is typically companies, a lot of companies in the B2B space, for example, that have dealt with the issues that I mentioned. This could be dealing with distributorships, dealing with clinical research organizations in the case of life sciences or pharmaceuticals, or in the cases of the financial industry, dealing with various financial business partners. So, really encourage you to take a look at EIG. I think this is one of the few tools that at least I'm aware of, or probably the only tool that has been built ground up to deal with external identity and access governance. So with that, today we covered cloud entitlements and we covered external identities. Hope you found some of this information useful. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions, and we'll continue on these topics in future sessions. We'll also have some guest attendees, a special guest for some of these shows. So I look forward to going deeper into these concepts. Once again, folks, thank you for joining and have a great day.